My husband struck the match while our daughter slept in her crib upstairs, and he made sure I smelled the smoke before I heard her cry. I was 28 years old. Sophie was 2, the kind of age where everything is discovery, where mama is still a sound that fills your chest with light, where bedtime means 3 books, 2 songs, and the ritual of her small hand patting my cheek before she surrenders to sleep. She had his dark hair, my stubborn chin, and a laugh that made strangers stop in grocery stores to smile at the sound of pure joy. David had been handsome once. Still was, objectively, the sharp jaw, the blue eyes, the charm that had made me ignore the red flags my mother saw from the first introduction. But handsome had curdled into something else in the 3 years of our marriage, the slow fermentation of control that started as protectiveness and ended as possession. He didn't like my job, didn't like my friends, didn't like the way Sophie reached for me first, cried for me when she fell, laughed louder when I sang the silly songs that David called undignified. He wanted to be the center, the sun, the gravity that held our small family in orbit. And when he felt himself slipping, when Sophie's first word was mama, when I got a promotion that meant longer hours, when I mentioned that my coworker Mark had been helpful with a project, he found a way to punish me that couldn't be undone. The fire started in the kitchen. I know because I found the accelerant later, the gasoline can hidden in the garden shed, the trail he'd laid from the stove to the stairs, the calculation that meant this wasn't accident or impulse. This was architecture. This was a man building a monument to his own rage and using our daughter as the cornerstone. I was in the garden when I smelled it. Tending tomatoes, the evening light golden on the leaves, the piece of a moment that felt like the life I'd wanted. The smoke came first, not flames, not yet, just the wrong smell in the wrong place, the acrid warning that something was burning that shouldn't be. I ran. Through the back door, through the kitchen where the fire was already climbing the walls, up the stairs where the heat was a physical thing that pushed back. I found her door locked. He'd locked it. The man who'd kissed her forehead at dinner, who'd read her goodnight moon with the voice of a father who loved her, had turned the key in her lock and walked downstairs to strike his match. I broke the door. Shoulder, foot, shoulder again, the pain distant, irrelevant, nothing compared to the sound of her crying on the other side. The room was filling with smoke, her crib near the window, her small body coughing, her face red and wet and terrified. I lifted her. I wrapped her in the blanket from her crib, the one with the elephants we'd chosen together before she was born, before we knew what David would become. I ran to the window. The drop was 20 feet, the ground hard, the fall dangerous. But the fire was behind us now, the door I'd broken feeding it oxygen, the hallway becoming an oven. I dropped her. Not dropped, lowered, released, the only calculation I could make in a moment that allowed no time for thought. She hit the grass, the blanket cushioning, the fall breaking her arm but not her life. I heard her scream as I jumped after, my ankle turning, my hands finding her, my body curling around hers as the window above us shattered from heat and the flames reached out like hands that wanted us back. David stood in the yard. He'd been watching. He had a garden hose in his hand, unused, the performance of a man who tried to help already prepared. He looked at me holding our daughter, her arm bent wrong, her face black with smoke, her lungs coughing out the poison he'd filled them with. "You did this," he said. His voice was calm. The voice he used when he was most dangerous, the voice that meant he'd already decided on the story, the blame, the narrative that would make him victim and me villain. "You left the stove on. You were careless. I didn't hear the rest." The neighbors had called 911, the sirens approaching, the fire consuming the house that had never been safe, that had always been his stage and my prison. I held Sophie and I made a promise. Not out loud. Just in the part of myself that the fire hadn't burned, that David hadn't reached, that still knew how to love without fear. "I will build you a home," I promised my daughter's shaking body, "from the ashes of what he burned, and he will watch us rise. Welcome to Little Bunny Stories. If you're here, maybe you know what it means to smell smoke and know it was lit by the person who promised to protect you. Maybe you know the particular horror of finding your child's door locked from the outside. Maybe you know what it's like to jump from a window with your daughter in your arms and land in grass that feels like the first solid ground you've ever known. If that's you, subscribe. Not because I have comfort, because I have ash. And because the story I'm about to tell you ends with me standing in a house I built with my own hands, watching my daughter graduate high school, while the man who tried to burn us alive watches from a prison visiting room that no longer scares me. Here's my story. The hospital was first. Sophie's arm, broken in 2 places, requiring surgery pins, a cast she wore for 8 weeks. Her lungs, smoke inhalation, permanent scarring, the asthma that would follow her through childhood like a shadow. Her mind, too young to process, old enough to remember, the night terrors that woke her screaming for years, the flinch at the smell of smoke, the way she checked door locks obsessively until I taught her that locks could also keep danger out. And me. My ankle sprained, not broken, but painful enough to slow me. My hands burned from the door, from the crib, from carrying her through heat that should have killed us both. My mind, the diagnosis I didn't expect, the PTSD that manifested not as flashbacks but as hypervigilance, the inability to sleep without checking every lock, every window, every shadow that might be a man with a match. David was arrested. Not immediately, he performed, he explained. He was the grieving husband, the distraught father, the man who tried to save them with a garden hose that never left his hand. But the accelerant was found, the gasoline can with his fingerprints, the trail through the kitchen, the locked door, the key in his pocket, the calculation that couldn't be explained as panic or accident. He was charged with arson, attempted murder, child endangerment. The trial took a year. I testified from a wheelchair at first, then standing, then walking to the witness stand with the steady gait I'd rebuilt through physical therapy and rage, and the need to show my daughter that falling doesn't mean staying down. David watched me. The blue eyes that had charmed me, that had convinced me, that had hidden the monster until the monster revealed himself. He smiled sometimes, the smile that said this was still performance, that the jury was audience, that he would find a way to win because he always had, because the world had always rewarded his handsome face and reasonable voice. The jury took 3 days. Guilty on all counts. 25 years, the judge said, the maximum. The recognition that some crimes deserve more than sympathy, more than understanding, more than the he was stressed narrative his lawyer had constructed. I didn't smile when they read the verdict. I held Sophie's hand. She was 3 by then, too young to understand courts and juries and the arithmetic of justice, old enough to know that the man who'd locked her door wouldn't be coming home. I held her hand and I felt something I hadn't expected. Not victory. Relief. The relief of a door closing that I'd thought would stay open forever. The relief of breathing in a house that didn't contain his presence, his performance, his poison. But I had nothing. The house was ash, insurance denied, David's policy voided by arson conviction, the legal battle for compensation dragging through appeals that would take years. I had no job, fired during my recovery, replaced, forgotten. I had no savings, David had controlled the finances, had drained what existed, had left me with debt and a credit score that made landlords laugh. I had Sophie. Her broken arm healed crooked, requiring a second surgery. Her lungs scarred, requiring inhalers, monitoring, the careful avoidance of smoke that would follow her through life. Her mind, her beautiful, resilient, 3-year-old mind that still laughed at silly songs, still reached for me first, still believed that the world was fundamentally good despite evidence to the contrary. That was enough. That was everything. I moved us to a shelter first. A domestic violence refuge that took mothers and children, that provided beds and food and counselors who understood that the fire was just the final act of a longer abuse. I stayed 3 months, long enough to heal physically, to begin therapy, to understand that my marriage hadn't been a mistake I'd made but a trap I'd survived. Then a transitional apartment. Small, subsidized, in a neighborhood where safety was relative and hope was scarce. I worked 2 jobs, 3 sometimes, whatever I could find that fit around Sophie's schedule, her medical needs, her night terrors that required me to be present when the darkness came. I cleaned offices at night. I stocked shelves before dawn. I took online courses during her naps, learned construction management, learned that my hands could build as well as they'd broken down doors, that my mind could calculate as well as it had calculated falls from windows. And I built. Not metaphorically, literally. I found a program, a nonprofit that trained women in construction trades, that provided tools and mentorship and the radical belief that a woman who'd survived fire could learn to work with it safely, to bend it to her will, to build hearths instead of escape routes. I learned carpentry, plumbing, electrical work, the wiring that made houses live, the currents that could kill or sustain depending on knowledge and respect. I learned masonry, the laying of brick and stone, the creation of walls that could withstand fire instead of feeding it. Sophie grew. She was 4, 5, 6, the years marked not by David's absence but by my presence, my hands. The home I was building in the spaces between jobs and school and the medical appointments that monitored her lungs, her arm, her mind that was healing in ways I hadn't dared hope. She helped. At first just handing me tools, helping in the way that children help, that creates more work than it saves. Then really helping, holding levels, measuring twice, the lessons I'd learned about precision and patience, and the satisfaction of building something that would outlast you. We built a tiny house, on land that the nonprofit leased cheap, a quarter-acre that had been vacant lot, that had collected trash and needles, and the despair of a neighborhood that had stopped expecting better. We cleared it together, Sophie and I, her small hands in gloves I'd bought at the thrift store, her determination matching mine as we pulled weeds and broken glass and the debris of other people's abandonment. The house was 400 square feet. One bedroom, a loft where Sophie slept, a kitchen where we cooked together, a bathroom with a tub deep enough for the long soaks that eased her asthma. I built it with my hands, my tools, the skills I'd learned in the program and refined through practice and failure, and the stubborn refusal to let David's fire be the last thing that defined us. We moved in on Sophie's 7th birthday. She blew out candles on a cake we'd baked together, in a kitchen I'd built, in a house that was ours in a way the burned house had never been. She made a wish, she told me later, whispered it in my ear before bed that we get to stay here forever, and Daddy never comes back. The second part was already true. David had appealed, lost, appealed again. He was in a prison 2 hours away, writing letters I didn't open, making calls I didn't accept, performing the devoted father to a daughter who'd forgotten his face and replaced it with mine. First part, forever, I couldn't promise. But I could build something that lasted, that grew, that became more than a tiny house on a quarter-acre lot. I started a business. Juniper Construction, named for the tree that grows in fire-scarred land, that sends roots through ash and emerges green where everything else is black. I hired women from the shelter, from the program, from the margins where talent and need went unnoticed because they didn't have the right connections, the right faces, the right performances. We built more tiny houses, then larger houses, then apartment buildings, community centers, a library in the neighborhood where Sophie and I had cleared trash, the space that had become possibility. I hired men too, the ones who understood that construction wasn't about gender but about skill, about showing up, about building something that would outlast the builder. Sophie grew. She was 10, 12, 15, the asthma manageable, the arm straightened by the second surgery, the night terrors fading into occasional dreams that she could wake from without screaming. She was strong physically, from helping on sites, emotionally, from therapy and love, and the example of a mother who jumped from windows and built from ash. She was also angry, at David for what he'd done. At me sometimes, for what she perceived as my failure to protect her, the locked door, the jump, the fall that had broken her arm and scarred her lungs. She was a teenager, and teenagers need someone to be angry at, and I was safer than the alternatives, the drugs or the streets or the boys who recognized her damage and wanted to exploit it. I let her be angry. I held the space for it, the way I'd learned to hold space for grief and fear and the complicated emotions that didn't have simple resolutions. I told her the truth about David, about the fire, about my own complicity in staying too long, in not seeing the signs, in loving the performance rather than the reality. And I told her about the promise, the one I'd made in the grass, holding her broken body, smelling her burned hair. The promise to build her a home from ashes, to let him watch us rise. He is watching, I said, when she was 16 and struggling with the identity of survivor, the weight of victim, the confusion of being defined by something she couldn't remember clearly but couldn't forget. Every letter he writes, every appeal he files, every attempt to reach you, he's watching. Not because he loves you, because he can't stand that you survived him, that we built something he couldn't burn. She thought about this. She was quiet for a long time, the way she'd been quiet as a child, the observer who'd learned early that the world contained dangers that adults didn't always see. Then let's show him, she said, not just surviving. Thriving, the thing he can't stand. We did, together. She graduated high school, not just graduated but excelled, the girl with scarred lungs and a crooked arm and a mind that had processed trauma into determination. She got into college, architecture, the study of buildings that would outlast their builders, that would shelter generations, that would stand against fire and time and the worst that humans could do. I visited David once. Not for Sophie, she refused, and I honored that refusal. Not for closure, I'd found that in building, in thriving, in the life that didn't include him. I visited because I needed to see him small, contained, stripped of the power he'd wielded with matches and gasoline and the locked door of a child's bedroom. He was smaller than I remembered. The handsome had faded, the charm calcified into bitterness, the performance become something desperate and pitiful. He looked at me with eyes that still calculated, still searched for leverage, still believed that the right words could unlock the door he'd closed on himself. "You look good," he said. "Successful. I always knew you had potential." I didn't respond to the compliment, the manipulation, the attempt to claim credit for what I'd built without him. I just looked at him, this man who'd tried to kill my daughter to punish me, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Not hate, not forgiveness. Indifference. The complete absence of the emotion he'd required from me, fear, love, anger, anything that confirmed his importance. I was indifferent to his existence in a way that was more final than any prison sentence. "I built her a home," I said, "from the ashes. She graduates college next year, architecture. She's going to build things that last longer than your sentence." His face flickered, the performance slipping, the monster showing through, then something else. Something that might have been regret, or might have been calculation, or might have been the simple human recognition that he'd lost, completely and finally, to the woman he'd tried to destroy. "Tell her," he started. "No," I said, "I won't tell her anything. She's not your audience anymore. I'm not your audience anymore." I stood, walked to the door, stopped with my hand on the frame the way I'd stopped so many times in these stories, these endings, these moments of final departure. "We're just gone. We've been gone since the night you struck your match. It just took you this long to notice." I left. I didn't look back. I heard him calling after me, the voice shifting from reasonable to desperate to rage, the full range of performances that had once controlled me. I didn't turn. I walked out of the prison, into sunlight, into the life that had become so full, so rich, so completely mine that his absence was no longer even a presence. Sophie graduated. Not just graduated, valedictorian. Her speech about building from ash, about the architecture of survival, about the homes we construct not just from wood and brick but from choice and persistence, and the refusal to let fire be the last word. I was in the audience. 42 years old, the owner of a construction company that employed 50 people, that had built 300 homes, that had transformed a neighborhood from vacancy to community. My hands were scarred, my lungs clear, my heart full in a way that I hadn't believed possible on the night I jumped from that window. She looked at me during her speech. Not for long, a glance, a smile, the recognition that we were in this together, that her success was our success, that the promise I'd made in the grass had been kept and exceeded. "Some people try to burn the world," she said, her voice steady, her green eyes, my eyes, not his, the eyes that had replaced his in my memory, scanning the crowd. "They lock doors and strike matches and believe that destruction is power. But fire doesn't end things, it reveals them. It shows you what's solid enough to survive, what's worth saving, what can be built from the ash that remains." She paused. She smiled. The smile that made strangers stop in grocery stores, that had survived the night terrors and the asthma and the identity of survivor's daughter. "I was saved by a woman who jumped from a window," Sophie continued. "Who broke her ankle and burned her hands and never once let me go. Who built me a home from nothing, who taught me that the opposite of fire is not water, it's construction. It's showing up, every day, with tools and plans and the stubborn belief that what was burned can be rebuilt stronger, safer, more beautiful than before." She looked at me again. The tears were running down my face, the kind of tears that come not from pain but from the overwhelming recognition that pain has been transformed, that survival has become thriving, that the story has reached an ending happier than any I could have imagined. "To my mother," Sophie said, "who taught me that ash is just the beginning." The applause was loud, sustained, the recognition of a story that had become public through her college application, her interviews, her refusal to let shame define what should be celebrated. I stood with the other parents, the other witnesses, the other survivors of various fires who recognized in her words their own potential for rebuilding. Afterward, she found me, hugged me, held me the way I'd held her in the grass, the way I'd held her through surgeries and night terrors and the years of building that had brought us here. "We did it," she whispered. "You did it," I corrected. "I just held the tools. You built the life." She pulled back, looked at me with the green eyes that were mine, that had never been his, that had seen fire and chosen construction. "Let's go home," she said. We did. To the house that wasn't tiny anymore, we'd expanded, built on, created space for her return, for her future, for the grandchildren I hoped for and didn't pressure. To the neighborhood that had transformed, that had become a community of people who'd built from their own ashes, who'd learned that survival was collective, that thriving required witnesses. To the life that David had tried to burn, that had become instead a beacon, a proof, a story that we told not for revenge but for hope. I'm Juniper. I'm 42 years old. I'm a mother who jumped from a window with her daughter in her arms, who built a home from ash, who learned that the opposite of fire is not water, it's construction. It's showing up every day, with tools and plans and the stubborn belief that what was burned can be rebuilt stronger, safer, more beautiful than before. If someone ever tried to burn your world to punish you, or if you're still clearing ash, still holding tools, still believing in what you can't yet see, drop a hammer below. I read every single comment. And if this story made you want to build rather than mourn, hit subscribe. We tell stories like this every week. What are you finally ready to build from your ash? Backhand index pointing down.